despite everything the Indian government has done vis-a-vis China, the trade between India and China continues to go up.
Yeah, it does. But they're keeping China out of critical sectors. So before Galwan, for example, China had targeted Indian startup companies and was particularly going after kind of critical software developers and things like that. A lot of that's been sort of more blocked off. You've heard about just recently. There was discussion about reopening trade with China. From what I understand, that's to give more visas to Chinese technicians to come into India to work on Indian-owned machines that are Chinese manufacture. So it's fairly contained. It's fairly specific and fairly contained. It's not a countries. These are very complex countries and very complex environments. Their policies can't look like ours. They have they do share a border with China. They're not confrontational in the way that they don't issue press releases saying we hate you. They do things that protect themselves and block off access and possibly hurt the other person without announcing it, but the other party knows. So it's not going to. It can't look like what our systems look like. The U.S. has had this luxury of at least thinking it's fairly isolated since the beginning. George Washington wrote at the beginning about the U.S.'s detached and distant situation. Forgetting that the British were right above him, and then there was Mexico, and of course the whole west of the country didn't quite exist yet. But the idea was, unlike the European countries, they're not surrounded by competitors on a consistent level. I mean, of course, I'm forgetting, of course, the First Nations. But that's this idea, and out of that idea came this perception of isolationism. That basically U.S. foreign policy has vacillated between isolationist or not. But the idea was always isolationism was an option. Isolationism isn't an option for India that has Pakistan on the border, Bangladesh on the border, China on the border, all that stuff. It's not going to look like that. And in fact, Grant Newsham, who you've had on the show, testified before Congress recently that isolationism isn't an option for the U.S. anymore either, because the way that China operates has erased distance. There's this erasure of distance through cyber warfare, through chemical warfare like fentanyl, through biological warfare like COVID, that has made it so that the U.S. is no longer in a detached and distant situation. The attacks are on the homeland now. But regardless, the foreign policy community in the U.S. still tends to have at least an element of isolationism in their mentality. And so you can't superimpose that over an understanding of how India operates.
Yeah, speaking of the trade thing, there was this article in The Economist that came out last month it was kind of about whether the bust-up between India and China is ending. And a lot of it was based on the idea that India is reliant on Chinese technology. And it was kind of positing this as India is going to have to balance what its military chiefs want, which is a more hawkish position on China, versus what its business leaders want, which is more trade with China and, more, I guess, Chinese tech and things like that. Do you think this is true, or is this analysis like a misreading using kind of that same, essentially, like you can make the same argument about Western countries, right? Like the idea that, does Germany want more Chinese automobiles, or does the U.S. need more Chinese whatever trade goods versus like a hawkish stance. So is it just superimposing this like Western framework on what's happening with India, or what's going on there?
So two things. The first thing is, again, to understand that India operates completely differently. In Indians, you can't have dual citizenship if you're an Indian. So it's not like even like a China, where you've got one foot out the door if you're an Indian entrepreneur, if you're running a major company. You need to be Indian to sort of buy land and do certain other things, and you can't be Indian and something else. So there's their operating environment as individual business leaders is very different. But and yeah, you have Chinese influence operations, and this issue about a third or fourth country always being involved. You'd think that it would be Chinese operatives who want to break up the India-US relationship, which they do, but so do the French. The French want to be the ones to sell the weapons to India, and the nuclear power plants and stuff to India, and things like that. So there are other countries that you might even think of as allies who want to create friction within the relationship. But the second thing, which kind of takes us in a different direction, but I think is relevant because it's something that you've experienced also, is the way that the media treats India, the Western media treats India. And if you mention The Economist in India, you'll get looks of absolute disdain. Same thing with the New York Times and various other what many people would consider totemic Western media houses. The perception within India is that they have an agenda, and part of the agenda is to denigrate India and to isolate it and to make it look less attractive to Western investors, and apart from other things, and including going after it socially and things like that. And they'll reference, for example, there was a New York Times advertisement for an India correspondent, which apparently said something along the lines of, must be willing to attack the Modi government for its bad policies or something. It was kind of, I'm paraphrasing, but I'm giving you the perception of what it's like on the ground. But this extends to social media. So there was a, I think the hashtag was "What's wrong with India." Somebody put out some tweet about something went wrong in India and hashtagged it "What's wrong with India." You're gonna have to check and make sure that's what it was, but I think it was something along those lines, and it went viral. And the Indian Twitter sphere or exosphere said, "This makes no sense. This doesn't make sense that this tweet would get picked up so much." So they started testing that hashtag with kind of putting up pictures of like homeless people in San Francisco, but putting that "What's wrong with India" hashtag to it. And those went viral as well. Those were also being amplified. So they were trying to show that there was something in the algorithm that was anti-India. And you'll get cases of, there's a very good podcaster called Adi, who does Adi Def Talks, and YouTube will consistently knock down his viewership and make it look like he doesn't have people watching, things like that. So anytime that we're getting coverage about India through our normal venues of information, which we may not trust on other topics. We know not to trust them on other topics. But where else are you going to be getting news about India unless you're going to the Sunday Guardian, for which I happen to write, but which happens to be a very good Indian newspaper, or many of the other Indian newspapers or television channels. We get this perhaps biased or some sort of view about India, which may not be complete, to be polite.